The text is a continuation of what was read last week. It is the 6th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. I read now from the 27th through the 36th verses these words. Would you hear them? But I say to you, says our Lord, that listen, love your enemies and do good to those who hate you. Bless those who curse you and pray for those who abuse you. If anyone strikes you on the cheek, offer the other also. And from anyone who takes away your coat, do not withhold even your shirt. Give to everyone who begs from you. And if anyone takes away your goods, do not ask for them to return. Do to others as you would have them do unto you. And if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For even sinners do the same. And if you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? For even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. But love your enemies. Do good and lend, expecting nothing in return, and your reward will be great, and you will be children of the Most High, for He is kind to both ungrateful and wicked. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Now, if you were here last week and you recall what I surmised, it is that I think you can argue with really no impunity that the Sermon on the Mount, Sermon on the Plain, depending on whether you're reading the 6th chapter of the Gospel of Luke or the 5th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, are these consequential verses of Jesus. Oh, I know. There are 37 miracles that are presented in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, and there are 41 parables, stories that hold our imagination and captured in our mind. And then, of course, there's the birth of Jesus and the resurrection and all of the events that are that Holy Week. But those are events captured in time and that are lasting for a moment. But the consequential words of Jesus, the sermons of Jesus, the outline of the work of Jesus, the structure by which we form our faith, these are in these chapters and what we know as sermons of Jesus that ask us how it is that we are to live and how we are to behave before one another and, far more importantly, before God. This is the constitution of the church. These are the Bill of Rights spelled out for people whose destination is heaven. And we are to live as though we are there, right here, right now. There's nothing more important. And so it's important that we get it right. And one of the things that we seldom do is misunderstand as it is what it is that we're saying. For instance, we sometimes think of the Sermon on the Mount as captured in the Beatitudes. You know, blessed are those who mourn. Blessed are those who hunger. Blessed for those who thirst for righteousness, because one day it will be returned to them. That's the preamble of the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain. But the preamble is not the same thing as the text itself, the law as it is put forth. It's done that way in the Old Testament as well. Sometimes we think to ourselves, well, the law as it comes down from Moses on Sinai is 10 commandments. You shall do these things. But in fact, the law of the Old Testament is not found one day when Moses is on Sinai, but it is captured in 613 various prescriptions about how we are to live, found in Leviticus and Numbers and Deuteronomy and Exodus besides. No, the law is not simply 10. That's the preamble that says there is a new way to construct your life. There is a new normative by which you shall be guided, and it is different than all you've experienced before. And that's why there are 613 of them, 248 corresponding what was then every bone of your body that was known at the time, and then 365 for every day of the week of things that you should not do that would keep you from God if you betray that volition. 613 rules, not 10, are what the people of God of Israel were supposed to follow. And for us, while it is important to understand the Beatitudes, understand them as prelude to what is about to be said. And you know what a prelude is? It's what Elaine plays. It sets the tone, the music, the sound, the room is different than all other places that you will venture in the course of the week. But it's not the words. It's not the text. The text this day is not about those who will be blessed either now or later, but it is about how you shall live, and it begins this way. But I say to you, listen, love your enemies and do good to those who hate you. That's different than every other prescription for how we are to behave. We live under another rule, and we sometimes tell ourselves, well, isn't it the same thing? Ours is a society that does not live under the commandment of Jesus to forgive. Our highest aspiration as a civilized people is to prescribe justice. And sometimes, mistakenly, we think of them as the same property when actually they're built on two different systems entirely. Justice is essentially a mathematical formula that has transcended itself to some kind of code of ethic. Justice is, you did this to me, and now in compensation, I should receive this. The limit of that was on trial this last week when the verdict of the police officer that mistakenly pulled not her taser but a gun and killed a man. Horribly fallen, knowing that prison was before her, she wept and wept for the life that she had mistakenly taken. But this family of the one whose life was lost said, I feel in hearing the verdict that was not for their ears and their family harsh enough. They said, I felt like my child had been killed again. Because there is no such thing as equality when a life is lost, and there is no gain that is more than equal to the pain and the hurt that transpired. Justice is a mathematical formula based as best it can on creating some kind of equality, but not really. And so Jesus introduces a new property and a new system of value. The system is not based on equality. It is not mathematically induced. It is instead something that comes from the heart. Because, remember, Jesus is not speaking of a kingdom that has yet arrived on earth, but one of certainty we know will be reality in heaven. And it is a different thing. And we are invited to live as a people on earth, grounded on turf, but with our destination known to us in the skies above. That's what's going on here. And so Jesus introduces this idea of forgiveness. And you and I know that forgiveness is not an easy thing to ascend. It is not a natural attribute. There is something that is disarming in its very nature that makes us vulnerable to all influences here on earth. We are protective of the notion of forgiveness because too exposed, we can be rampant, run over with permissivism and every other thing that would be to the detriment of our personal life. We really aren't all that interested in forgiveness. We like revenge. We love to hold a grudge. We want to pretend that somehow, if there was a wrong committed, there is a right that will somehow make those two things even out. And yet, time and again, we leave disappointed when, having received justice, we feel still in our heart and in our soul a sense of emptiness. Jesus said, forgive. But what is he really asking us to do? The problem for most of us is, I believe that we think that the property of forgiveness is actually rooted in our past. And it has nothing to do with our past. Forgiveness is looking at what has occurred, examining it, and saying, oh, I can let go of it now. That's what we think of as forgiveness. It's focusing on what injustice had occurred and saying, okay, I'm going to let go of that. I'm going to pretend it didn't happen. I'm going to push it away, when that isn't it at all. Forgiveness is not rooted in the property of the past, but it is always oriented to our future. It is saying, I reject what has happened and I embrace what God can do in my future. And by embracing our future, we are necessarily letting go of the grudges that hold our past. Forgiveness is saying, this isn't working for me anymore, and if I want it to be better, then I must do it differently. Jesus said, do not just forgive those who are good to you. Forgive those that have done you evil, not pretending that it didn't happen, but saying, see what that gets you and how little you really receive. I invite you to a new way, a new property, and to a new relationship. Now, the truth of the matter is, all religions say it. You think about them. Buddhism practices the concept of forgiveness. They practice it not so much as a concept to be practiced as much as an invitation to take a different path. Judaism said that you are to forgive once and twice and 3 times. And then you just have to be practical about it, and there has to be some justification for what continues to occur. Islam, though terrorists have sometimes misunderstood, the idea and property of forgiveness as a law is mentioned over 100 times. But it is unique to the Christian faith. The forgiveness is offered not in the context of how many, but unlimited, without exemption, 7 times 70. In other words, for infinite amount, because the future is without end. Only the past can be numbered in its days. And so, when we think of forgiveness, we need to think of it as the unlimited quality that God possesses and wishes for us. Now, the truth of the matter is, I say all of that, but you and I live in a finite world, and the fact of the matter is, we don't work and we don't operate that way in most of our times. I don't know, the idea of forgiveness, it just doesn't have the allure as grudging and battle between two places. For instance, I don't know about you, but last Sunday evening about 6 o'clock, I was in my religious devotional stance watching the Super Bowl. Maybe some of you were as well. If you were joining with me, you weren't alone. 114 million people tuned in to watch the game, or at least the commercials. And when they watched, I want to just ask you the question. If they had watched not a contest to see which team would beat the other, but if they had watched a contest between two teams to see who could have forgiven the other side more than the other one, do you think the same number of people would have tuned in to watch? What if the announcer had said, "Oh, look at there, the Bengals just scored, and look how the Rams just come over and forgive them and forgive them and forgive them. Watch how they say, 'Great play, you really fooled me on that one. You go get them. I forgive you. I know you didn't mean it.'" And when the Rams scored, did the announcers say, "Watch those Bengals go over there and say to those Rams, 'Boy, you guys are the best team on earth'"? No, they don't do that. Nobody's interested in watching one side forgive another side. What we want to do is we want to see a winner, and that necessarily means we'll watch somebody lose. We want to see the trophy held high. We want to see somebody exclaimed at the expense of all others. That's the way we live. But it's a zero-sum game. It's simplistic to do this, but it is important, I think, to see that right now, in the midst of global turmoil, in a country called Ukraine, there are two sides, both with an argument that is similar even as it is different. Russia, who claims that Ukraine used to be a part of us, and our defense is compromised if they slide too deeply into the West. And the West, who argues these are a people that have their right to choose destination of their own and should not be overcome simply because a neighboring country is stronger and bigger than they. Both sides claim it is their self-interest that that entity be consumed in one or the other way of life. And because two rights can never be equally satisfied in a finite world and a fallen creation, enmity is at hand. Danger is around. The only solution is forgiveness. It isn't readily accepted because in order to practice, it must be first acknowledged that we are vulnerable. And that's the last thing a nation state wants to say to another. But if practiced in its selfish limits, destruction is always its result. Jesus said, I offer you a new way to experience here on earth what God will usher in His kingdom that is without end. I say, forgive your enemies, not just your friends. It's a difficult thing to do. I make no bones of that. But I do remember something that Fred Craddock, professor of mine, told the story of. He was down in Atlanta. He was to the Rotary Club of Atlanta making the presentation for the day. All of the business leaders of that big community were there and gathered. He was on the dais that was up above the crowd to which he was bespeaking. And he noticed a man that was next to him, and he knew that he knew him, but he didn't know how he knew them, and he'd never met him before. And so because it just was on him, he thought to himself, I need to introduce myself. I'd like to know who this individual is. And he reached out his hand and he offered it to the man, and he said, my name is Fred Craddock. I think I've seen you, but I don't know that we've ever met. And the man said, we've never met before. He said, my name is John Ehrlichman. Do you remember him? Counsel to the president for President Richard Nixon, domestic advisor in charge of virtually all things domestic during the Nixon White House years. He was also a co-conspirator in Watergate. Served time in prison, and what I didn't know was after prison, because he was really good at this stuff, he helped Atlanta and other areas in mixed-use communities and the development of such. He owned a small business here in Atlanta and lived quietly in his years of retirement. Craddock said when he saw him, "Oh, I now see it. You were in that Watergate stuff." He said, "Yes." He said, "I was." "Well, good to meet you." And Ehrlichman said, "Do you mean it?" He said, "Well, yeah, I mean it." I said, "Good to meet." He said, "Well, I say that because most people, when they meet me, and if they didn't know who I was, they turn my back on me. And they refuse to speak to me, and they walk away." And Craddock said, "They do?" He said, "Yeah." And he said, "Many of them are people like you." "People like me? What have I done?" He said. He said, "Well, you're a minister, aren't you?" He said, "Yeah." He said, "You know, the trouble I found with the church is they're quick to convict you of your sins, but they don't want to do anything to forgive you of them much." He said, "You mean the church hasn't told you about the grace, the love, and the forgiveness of God?" And he said there was a tear in Ehrlichman's eyes, and he said, "No, I'm afraid they've never shared that with me since my time in prison." Forgiveness. If we don't practice it, who will? If we don't remember that there is something distinctive in this hour and in this place on which there is a cross that rests on top, and from which the last words of Jesus were, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do," then what are we doing here? And what are we really about? The Sermon on the Mount is not the confirmation of our best behavior to one another, being our best self with those that think and act similarly to us. The Sermon on the Mount is a new way that invites us to a new life whose end is eternity, and nothing less will do. And Jesus invites those in a weary world who had been beat and spat upon, who had been considered second class and worse, and said, "Not long will this last. There is a new reality, and my presence ordains it." We have come not to relitigate old grudges or even to be our best self, but to claim a citizenship rightly given to those that would call his name and follow him forevermore. Or, as it was said in Shakespeare, the quality of mercy is not strained, for it falls upon us as a gentle rain, and those that stand beneath it are twice blessed, those that give it and those that receive.